This is the first edition, or first part of the Khoodeelaar campaign, World Exclusive Diagnosis of Fleet Street. Now, on the Boris graph, that is Boris Johnson graph, this is the Boris Johnson graph, has got the quite kind of inconsistent headline, inconsistent with the general kind of narrative, that is the view based on, broadly speaking, scientific evidence-based opinion. Now, if they're going to scrap isolation for COVID contacts, then what's the point? What are they doing in protecting people that are supposed to have been protected by the isolation? And then there is a kind of contradiction to Sunday's Fleet Street coverage about the UK Finance Minister Rishi Sunak. The main line was that he was going to reintroduce cuts, the program of cuts to public spending. In other words, they kind of glamorize it and hide it and conceal it by using the lying word austerity. Now, austerity is not only lying, it's also deeply kind of criminally distorting of the kind of Christian kind of quote ethos and morality frame. Austere is a kind of morality linked kind of reluctance to consume and to kind of use in excess whatever. But austerity introduced to hide cuts is the opposite of anything moral. This abuse of austerity is a double deception and double lie and double crime, because it hides the cruelty program, the negligent program, the callous program, the uncaring program that penalizes those most in need, denies basic support to those most in need. And it is absolutely significant that the Labour Party, numerically the main opposition in the House of Commons for the past 11 years, since the cons returned, the Labour Party has not made much of it. In fact, it hasn't really made any noticeable objection to the double abuse of this concept of austerity. And in that double distortion and lying, the cons have hidden some of the most ferocious attacks on the most in need, the most deprived, the most in poverty, most in low income, most in lacking housing human rights, employment human rights, and social human rights over 10 years. 10 years predating, 10 years before the virus, the COVID-19, appeared on the soil of the UK, or the soils of the UK. Yesterday's claim, peddled by some of the racist Brexiteering, Johnson supporting organs in Fleet Street, to the effect that the Labour Party was unlikely to regain the parliamentary seats across the north unless the Labour Party became more racist, because the word they use is woke, that the Labour Party was being called on to give up wokeism, as they say. Woke is another word created by racists who deny racism exists. And in order to hide the accurate word and its impact, race and racism, they've devised this word woke. Just like their denial in the linguistic kind of frame of the identities of the African and Asian people by criminally, offensively, inaccurately, falsely, and diminutively devised the word BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. A more offensive, corrupt phrase is very hard to imagine. So the Boris graph is hiding other things as well in the front page, because there is a line underneath, and the bottom line, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items on the bottom line. And one of them is most significant, which should be actually on the kind of main headings, one of the main headings, which is that railway nationalization is gathering speed. The privatization of the railway system has not solved the dysfunction of the British Rail that had been the main problem when it was mainly a nationalized state. The reason why privatization hasn't solved the problem, the reason why privatization did not solve the problem of the problems created by the corrupt bureaucracy and self-servers during the nationalized years is not because the nationalization, the idea of nationalized kind of service was to blame. It was the culture of unaccountability, the lack of accountability that pervades the whole institutions, a whole lot of institutions and agencies of the state in the UK. And it starts from Parliament. As we pointed out, reports that MPs have just voted for or kind of colluded with an increase by £3,000 a year to their allowances. Now, on average, the income of the ordinary constituents, most of them in the north and most of them in the inner cities, including London, including Tower Hamlets, including Newham, Hackney, Lewisham. Tower Hamlets, Hackney, Lewisham, and Newham are, of course, the 4 London boroughs that are kind of saddled with, lumbered with the additional corruption and additional deprivation creating elected mayor posts. In all of these boroughs, the actual earning and the income of ordinary people has gone down. Whereas members of parliament, including members of parliament from Tower Hamlets and Newham, have now voted for the increase in their income by £3,000 a year. And if the MPs cannot see the difference, cannot see the stupidity of their greed, then of course it needs to be pointed out that that is because MPs are unfit for democracy. Unfit, not in theory, they could be delivering democracy if they wanted to, but they don't want to. And that's the general culture in Britain of unfitness and dysfunction and unaccountability. That is because there is no accountability. And the so-called Fourth Estate, the Fleet Street newspapers, are as unaccountable, as untruthful, as much in denial as the MPs. So the only time they Fleet Street, most of them, we leave out the Guardian and the Daily Mirror. The only time the right wing, which is anti-Labour and pro-conservative and pro-reactionary and pro-cruelty and pro-deprivation and denial creating, Daily Mail, Rupert Murdoch's The Scum, also known as The Sun, the legacy of Beaverbrook, Daily Express, and the Express Group, and the Star, Daily Star. The only time when they kind of find it necessary or justifiable or relevant to refer to MPs' misconduct or bad behavior or lack of accountability or betrayal of democracy and denial of democracy and denial of the rights of the people they're supposed to represent honestly, democratically, accountably, answerably, and transparently. The only time they do that in the main is when the Labour Party MPs kind of slip up. It applies mainly to the Daily Mail, the Sun, and the Express. Less so to the Star, Daily Star. And the Daily Express, which is the Rupert Murdoch type legacy of the Beaverbrook, he's forever looking for any kind of excuse to put a headline that shows Boris Johnson fronted cabal as doing fantastic good for the community and the society. And as is the case today, they've got its official, Christmas is saved. So there's another thumbs up for Johnson. And suddenly, mysteriously, starting this week, the Kerry Simmons factor has disappeared from the Fleet Street papers, which shows that there is a orchestration behind every single story like that. That Kerry Simmons was controlling Boris Johnson, that she was prompting Boris Johnson to say one way or the other when he was on the phone to ministers and senior employees, also known as the civil service, civil servants, and also known as the Whitehall employees, and various other similar kind of words and phrases that do not really reflect the truth of the role and the behavior. But this is part of the gullibles being brainwashed over centuries. By centuries, at least 200 years of the Fleet Street newspapers, or the newspapers that are known collectively as Fleet Street. 200 years and they've been lying. Fleet Street has been lying and brainwashing the indigenous, vast majority of the white people indigenous, into brainwashed state of ignorance, denial, and blind kind of hatred against other people. which is the capital, exploited by the Beaverbrook Daily Express, dirty Rupert Murdoch's Daily Scum, and the corrupt Rothermere's Daily Mail Group in flaunting and promoting Nigel Farage, whom they have now forgotten, in promoting hatred of the European Union, hatred of the migrants, hatred of the Muslims. And Gavin Williamson is being given a spot by the Daily Express, doing what Matt Hancock has done a couple of days ago. Hancock was given a headline allegedly thanking the kind of ordinary doctors and nurses in the NHS. And they have done that by using the COVID kind of service that they acknowledge the NHS ordinary people have been doing. And there is this other thing by the Daily kind of Beaverbrook Express, which suppresses the truth. So we call it the Daily Suppress. It's overhyping Rishi Sunak and saying that Rishi's 220 million boost to help Britain take back control of our borders. Take back control of our borders. And there is a piece about the Trump. Well, for a start, that report initially, that Trump was plotting to run for president in 4 years' time, was completely incredible. That is, it lacked basic credibility, even accepting that Trump never had any credibility about anything. But this time they are confessing humiliated Trump will not run again in 4 years. Well, that cannot happen anyway, because by 4 years' time, Trump's criminality in office will be revealed as having been so serious that he will have no time to breathe about running for president again. And there is a piece about the countryside in Britain, and it says how reintroducing lost species can restore Britain's nature-depleted countryside to its full natural glory. And there is this piece about the countryside. Of course, the Beaverbrook legacy of poisonous lying, that is the Daily Express, the suppresses the truth about how the countryside is being destroyed by the right wing and the reactionaries and the murderers of animals and destroyers of the plants and flora and fauna. And there is a piece in the suppress about the terrorists, two convicted terrorists back on UK streets, and so on. And there is no evidence of any kind of absence of accountability by the British Parliament, the British government, British institutions. And there is most certainly no reference to the continuing abject failure to comply with the requirements of the various treaties, agreements, charters, conventions that the UK as an entity remains signed up to, while flouting all these requirements and the aims and purposes of these. And even the Daily Mirror is on the bandwagon, promoting Johnson as having allowed Christmas to go ahead. Now, this is a complete diversion, of course, because talking about Christmas excuses them staying silent on what matters: the poverty, the discrimination, the racism, the hatred, that all of that are the real issues every day to millions of people. And the Mirror goes even further and overhypes the Christmas being kind of brought by Johnson. So it's unacceptable that the Mirror still pretends in its editorial kind of column that it is for the poor. And it's talking about pay freeze of the public service workers. And Kevin McGuire is being described as a stalker, stalking the corridors of power. Kevin McGuire is kind of completely dishonest, absolutely bogus. And then they've got a Daily Mail type or the Sun type headline piece about a cop killer who repeatedly attacks guards in prison, then sues over breaches to his rights. Now, this is an interesting one we shall be going on. We shall be talking in detail about the reports about a cop killer or any other killer or criminal kind of abusing and exploiting the legal system, which is the absolute untruth and a lie. It doesn't happen. And the reason why it doesn't happen as they paint it is because the licensed law traders and the court system and the court bureaucracy are the ones that are doing the kind of they're exploiting the system and the money and the obstructions, and they are the ones who are pocketing the money. Licensed law traders doing the cases in the name of the cop killer, so-called, and other criminals. These are the people who are pocketing the money, fleecing the available fund, whatever the sum at the given time is, available sums under the heading of legal aid. And the legal aid goes to licensed law traders, not the persons in whose names these law traders make the application for money. And they've got a most emotional, typically emotional, kind of anti-Muslim, anti-Islam piece on the Times. This headline reminds of the overzealous way in which the Times and Andrew Norfolk falsely claimed that a blonde Christian girl was converted to Islam or was forced to behave as a Muslim in a foster kind of home or foster family. Now, this one is on page 4 of the Times, and it says asylum plea for Christian girl raped and forced to convert to Islam. And this is a piece about This is another piece against Pakistan. Not Pakistan as a kind of government or state, but the idea of Pakistan is what is at the center of this. The idea of Pakistan, let's say Pakistan, in the kind of calculations of the Fleet Street and the racist mainstream in the West, Pakistan symbolizes the opposite of, let's say, everything that the racists would prefer to see on the world stage. Pakistan is a country that is based on, but it's not necessarily being run as a Muslim country. There are other Muslim countries, let's say Indonesia, Malaysia, and most of the Arabian countries are Muslim populated. North African countries are Muslim populated. But the Pakistan association with, or link with, or its embodiment of being a Muslim populated country, links go back to the time when, in 1947, the British Raj ended. And that was the kind of factors. Pakistan is a Muslim populated country, majority Muslim, and what is now India, containing mainly provinces that were majority Hindu populated. And in 1947, the Pakistan that is now today was bigger than what it is now today, because the today's state of Bangladesh was part of Pakistan, based on the same kind of electoral kind of demarcation that was, if you like, devised by the British, the departing British. And the states and the parts that were kind of mainly Muslim majority became parts of Pakistan, and parts that were mainly Hindu majority became parts of India. So instead of calling it independence from the British Raj, the British media and the British narrative has insisted on calling it partition. So shifting completely the attention away from the 190 years of imperialism into what eventually in practice, a blaming the minority in terms of the subcontinent's population. In religious terms, Muslims are smaller in number than the Hindus. So for example, today, the combined population of the subcontinent, 200 million Muslims in India, and another, say, 350 million Muslims in India and Pakistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan. So it's about just under 600 million Muslims. And the number of Hindus is not twice as many, but almost twice as many. So for 73 years, the Fleet Street and the BBC have run the narrative that Pakistan is the problem of the world. And the reason is that they can focus on Pakistan as being created by an election organized by the British, conducted by the British. But Pakistan is the name that goes straight into the heart of the hatred agenda, the crusading agenda that has persisted for 1200 years, 1300 years in the West. And the crusading anti-Muslim agenda is tagged onto Pakistan, latched onto Pakistan. The irony is that in Pakistan, all the kind of governmental, democratic democracy deficit, anti-democratic behavior and corrupt behavior by the governments, successive governments in Pakistan over the last 73 years. They have been ignored effectively by the media, the British media, by Fleet Street, by the BBC. The only time they have paid any attention to politically what has been going on in Pakistan is when they can isolate Islam and attack it. The truth is that Pakistan is not an Islamic state, never has been. But the allegation against it has been that it is. And it is an allegation based on symbol. The symbolic constitution of Pakistan as a Muslim country or Islamic country is what the racists, exploiting any vulnerability to secular criticism of an Islamic society or Muslim majority society. And that is the angle that they have been over applying for 73 years. They have not talked about the democracy movement in Pakistan either when it was in pre-1971 years, combined East and West Pakistan, that is Bangladesh today and Pakistan today combined as Pakistan. All the democracy movements, the anti-corruption movement, the movements for accountability and transparency by campaigners in both wings of then Pakistan were ignored by the British media, by Fleet Street and by BBC and by the British government or governments. So the only time that they can find anything or anyone with a Pakistani attachment that is acceptable is when anyone is able to complain against Pakistan society, Muslims. So that is this girl, Christian girl, being converted. Yes, raped and forced to convert to Islam. That is a very kind of typical package. And when Malala Yousafzai was attacked for her widely reported now kind of campaign as a child for girls to be given equal access to schools and education, so-called. That became the most explosive combination of plausible grounds for attacking the idea of Pakistan as a Muslim country. But these attacks on this girl, Malala Yousafzai, would never be justified according to Islam. And anyone who attacks anyone, any child or any woman, any person, in the described way that they attacked Malala Yousafzai, would be contravening Islam and Islamic code. But this is an ironic kind of example. Ironic example of the so-called Islamic movements and Islamic kind of leaders and Islamic kind of governments and Islamic politicos in Pakistan and in fact in other countries as well with Muslim majority population is that the violations, all the violations are against Islam. They haven't, and these leaders and these Muslim regimes have failed to point out that these are against Islam and that they have been as actively hostile and opposed to these violations and breaches as anybody outside could ever be. Any Times reporter or any UK government or any BBC or any Fleet Street paper would or ever could be. In other words, in the Muslim countries, including Pakistan, during 1947 and 1971, when it had two wings, failed to carry out a program of legislation lawmaking that would ban and make offenses out of these crimes and criminality against women, against girls, against other innocent people, whatever background, whatever faith, religion. So the slogan has been there, the banner has been there for the enemies of Islam, according to this particular record of 73 years of anti-Muslim racism and hostility and hatreds spewed by Fleet Street by using the tag Pakistan. For example, the wife of a conservative kind of aide to David Cameron, who was Joanna Gosling, who was a news presenter on the BBC News Channel. I haven't watched the news channel on a daily basis for a significant amount of time, at least since maybe November last year, 2019. But Joanna Gosling is one of the typical kind of British media morons that appears to be professional in the setup and the gear and the kind of studio. But up there, there is hardly any substance where substance should be, in the place supposedly called the brain. She and Kerry Gracie, who is otherwise highly overly promoted as a very efficient, highly achieving woman BBC News kind of presenter, news journalist. Kerry Gracie and Joanna Gosling have identical brainlessness when they refer to Pakistan. Not Pakistan as a country or as a government, but Pakistan as a symbol. Make the distinction. And the symbol is, it's a trigger. Pakistan triggers Islam in their brains because that's how they're brainwashed. And whether or not Islam is in practice in Pakistan makes no difference to them. What makes the difference is that Pakistan can be used as a tool, as a symbol of the worst kind of society that could be found on the planet Earth, anywhere. That's not the case, but that is how the brainwashing has been going on for 73 years. Well, 73 years since the formal withdrawal of the British Empire, but it's actually since before 1757. Because the whole of the subcontinent, what is now Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, all of the subcontinent was under the control, political control, military control of Muslims. Now, it's the same point I have to make. There were Muslims and they did a lot of secular things in the 700 years that the Muslims were the main kind of controllers of the subcontinent, including leaving legacies like the Taj Mahal. But they didn't introduce universal values derived from Islam in a way that could last or outlast their demise as the powers. And that is corruption. That is lack of compliance by them to the core requirements of Islam, the values of Islam. Same thing is happening today. Same thing is happening on the part of the Muslims or the Muslim named kind of personnel in politics or politicos in countries including Pakistan, not exclusively in Pakistan, but including Pakistan. Muslim majority countries where the controlling political cabals and groups and gangs are in daily breaches of the core values, universal values, internationalist values, liberating values that are derived and can only be derived from the Islamic faith. That is a gap. That is a gap like day and night gap difference. And yet the Times today is running this story which is equating Islam with brutality and rape and forced conversion. That's not the case. That is a story based on the culture of criminality and rape that is dominant in Pakistan. Just like the culture of rape and abuse of power is dominant in Bangladesh, where gang rapes happening even after the gang rape of the young girl in the MC College in September 2020. And the other aspect about this story about the Times is asylum plea. Of course, this child deserves asylum, but she deserves asylum for what she has suffered. She doesn't deserve asylum because she is kind of a victim of these criminality and crimes in a society where the majority of the population and the government are Muslim. Because the asylum, the need for asylum is a human right. It should not be conditional on the faith or the identity of the oppressors and the violators. So if we accept that, then all these millions of children, women, and other people seeking asylum and being blocked by Britain should be the focus of the investigation by the Times, which isn't doing that, which is not talking about the need for asylum by those people, millions of whom are waiting and desperate and are victimized and have been victimized by and have been victims of rapes, destitution, and other abuses and violations by people of all backgrounds, of all faiths. So what the Times is doing, the Fleet Street paper we're diagnosing, is lying. And it should not be lying, because the pretense, the fakery, the kind of presumption on which it bases its claim to be concerned about this girl, that is not substantiated by its practicing of the values, universal values. So, for example, when the earthquake hit Pakistan a while back, some years ago, killing a large number of people in Pakistan, that quake, The Guardian in London ignored that story. And instead, on the front page, The Guardian splashed with a completely fabricated, bogus, twisted, diplomatic kind of incident story involving China. It never kind of had traction, that story. But that was The Guardian doing what The Guardian did during the poisonous years before Alan Rasbija took over from Preston. And it was a kind of combination of toxicity, of wanton hatred of Islam. Nothing to do with the particular country, but Islam. And that is what happens with The Guardian. And that is what happens with the Times. That is what happens with the Fleet Street. Not because of the kind of operation of unintended prejudice or bias or ignorance. If one single Christian girl being raped and forced to convert to Islam can constitute a seriously worrying incident, what the internationally addressed kind of story, as the Times item does show today, then the mass rapes of Muslim children, Muslim women, Muslim girls in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in India also deserve due, dedicated, rigorous, and seriously intended, outraged coverage and reporting. But those are ignored by the Times. Those are ignored by The Guardian. Those are ignored by the rest of Fleet Street. Those are ignored by the BBC mainstream and the Sky News Television and the Channel 4, Channel 5, ITV, all of them. In the case of the UK, and the same thing happens when you take into account their counterparts' outfits across the USA and in France and Western Europe, and the media across Western Europe, especially in the current climate, the media in France, because Macron has staged a diversion by inventing himself as the target of hatred by Muslims. But Macron completely misrepresents the position. As Sarkozy did while Sarkozy was in post and power, and or when Sarkozy was cultivating Libya's Gaddafi solely for huge funds to fund Sarkozy's election bid in 2007. So successive holders in political power posts in France, as in the rest of Western Europe, in the main, with the exception, perhaps, limited exception of Angela Merkel in Germany, in the same time frame, let's say in the last kind of 2 decades, serial kind of politicos across Western Europe, including France, including the UK, of course, have abused their so-called democratic systems, and they have exploited and colluded with the so-called free media, whose considerable propaganda kind of weight and impact combined has been targeted to destroy images of Muslim targets, let's say, Muslim country, Muslim name, Muslim whatever. And that's a crusade. It's not based on the current behavior of those countries or the failure by the governments in those countries to deliver to the population in those countries according to the values that are otherwise kind of hypothetically supposed to exist in the West, across the West, and in North America. By North America, we of course refer to the USA and Canada. Now all these countries collectively, when it comes to the crusade, still believe in the values of the crusade or the aims and purposes of the crusade, which they are continuing. And the concentration of hatred against Muslims that Boris Johnson repeatedly exploits and has been exploiting as the main capital to successfully stage the political coup that he did stage against Cameron and then Theresa May and then got in. This shows the power to these racist crusaders that the tag Islam holds, not based on the behavior of Muslims, but based on the need for these crusaders to invent a scenario which includes assumed bad behavior by Muslims and only by Muslims. So when we talk about the contempt of the collective Fleet Street media, the 10, let's say 10, let's see how many there are. Is it 10? Is it 12? How many Fleet Street titles are there currently at this date, at this stage, when we are talking about this on the Monday, the 23rd of November, 2020. So the papers include The Guardian, The Times, the Daily Boris Graph, also known as the Telegraph.
This is the definition of graph. A diagram showing the relation between variable quantity.
The Boris Graph and the Murdoch-owned, Murdoch-controlled scum, The Sun, the Beaverbrook legacy, the Daily Express, and its tiny kind of offshoot, the Daily Star, which didn't exist in Beaverbrook's time, the Express did, and the Daily Mail, Rothermere, and the Financial Times, which is pretentiously kind of peddled as the one that is edited by a woman born in Beirut in the Lebanon. And the idea is that, like Alamuddin, the woman who has married George Clooney, she was born a Muslim in the Lebanon, and now has abandoned her Muslim surname, has become Amal Clooney. Now, these people don't recognize the entire Arab-speaking Arabian countries, and they don't recognize Indonesia, they don't recognize Malaysia, they don't recognize, of course, Pakistan or Bangladesh, despite the fact that there are significant differences between Bangladesh and Pakistan in terms of politics, in terms of the experiences of the people over the events of 1971 and before. And the common thing that the Crusader culture kind of block of mainstream media share among themselves is that all these countries are Muslim populated, or majority in their population is Muslim. And this is why it has to be understood why the behavior of the French President Macron has provoked the likes of Turkish President and Malaysia's politician Mahathir Mohamad into issuing what would normally be, in the current kind of diplomatic context and framework, normally be rare kind of language used by one political post holder or recently retired post holder about the head of state of another country. Because in the villages in Bangladesh, as compared with the kind of newspapers in Bangladesh, the newspapers in Bangladesh are not kind of covering or reporting anything like even 1% of what is going on in the rural areas, in the out of the capital areas, if you like. People are protesting against the statements made by the French President Macron. And similarly, significant amount of protests are taking place in Indonesia among the ordinary people, in Malaysia, and in Pakistan among the ordinary people. So what Macron has to understand, and what the Times has to understand, the Guardian has to understand, is that the hostility and hatred against Muslims that the Guardian represents, and the Times represents, and Macron represents, these are real hostilities. They know this, Macron knows this, the Times knows this. So this is real. This is not some kind of fantasy situation. This is not anything to do with. Macron would never accept a description of him as a terrorist. And he shouldn't be, because he is not directly involved in terrorism. And nor would the Times, nor would the Guardian. But what they are doing is actually violating the rights of more people who are Muslim than any terrorist would have violated the rights of their targets. Because the targets could be finite, could be defined as the actual people hit by the terrorist attacks. And terrorism is not a Muslim thing. Terrorism, as described nowadays, was a non-Muslim trait by many of the revolutionaries and other people, and including the people who founded the State of Israel. So the Fleet Street media and the BBC and Macron and Boris Johnson and others need to accept that if we are to have a world that is based on genuine respect and tolerance for people of various faiths, backgrounds, and ethnicities, then equality of platform and say must be provided to all parties. That is brazenly lacking in the contents of the behavior and the agenda and the records of the Times, the Guardian, and the rest of Fleet Street. And that has to be reversed.